Hey everyone, and welcome back to another Shadowlands video. So, 36 specs across 12 classes. It can be next to impossible to decide what to focus on, especially if it feels like, a massive commitment at the start of the expansion. And that's why we're exploring this stuff now. So, if you want to keep up to date on ranged DPS, how things are shaken out, then this is the video for you, and we will have the other roles out pretty soon. Of course, it is alpha, so we're going to be running through today how each spec at its baseline roughly feels and the major pros and cons, as well as anything that you should know about their toolkit. This is, of course, pre-borrowed power. Now, since we're in early alpha, things are subject to change, so we're not really going to focus on game balance and comparisons to other specs, except where, there historically have been ones. There's one thing to establish now, though, straight up. Almost every single one of these is going to feel worse at the start of Shadowlands than it does in patch 8.3, and that is simply because of the lack of the borrowed power of the BFA expansion and lower secondary stats. But it should be a fun video. We're going to go through a lot of content today, so with that all laid out, let's just get straight in. To start with today, let's talk about the druid. So they get Heart of the Wild across their specs, as well as some strong utility like Cyclone and Stampeding Roar. That's something a lot will be happy about. But of course, since this is the ranged DPS roundup, we will purely be talking about balance for now. So for the Boomkin changes, first they've returned to the Eclipse system in Shadowlands, and it now works on a hard cycle between solar and lunar eclipses. Yes, it has actually changed from the initial version of the alpha. And that basically means, right, that when you're in combat, you have got to cast 3 wraths to get your lunar eclipse rolling to empower your starfires, and once that eclipse is over, then casting 3 regular starfires will get solar, eclipse for your empowered wraths. And to be honest, that sucks pretty bad in some situations. Astral power extending those eclipses does add in a little bit of compelling gameplay, right, with throwing in your star surges to extend them, but it's not really that much control overall, and you still do very much feel at the whim of the pace of that system. So, to cover some of the more positive things, for how this spec feels, yes, you still alternate which spells to cast while keeping up dots, using your talented abilities, and then dumping your astral power on either Star Surge or Starfall. Now, Starfall has also been reverted to its old form. This is pretty sweet. It automatically surrounds the druid and just falls down from the stars, rather than being ground targeted. It's pretty sweet. Their strength in AoE of, casting on the move with Stellar Drift could really make them feel great, just, in those, fast movement situations, and also in a sort of post-target cap world. So that's all pretty good. And overall, their kit does leave them, I would say, quite functional across the board in most forms of content. There's not really a massive amount of depth here, I would say, but there is enough to make it feel like an all-rounder spec. Then, in addition, Shadowlands' design ethic just helps out in a way the druids should really be known for. Their utility is varied and it is strong. Most notably, Heart of the Wild has potential to be very useful when things go wrong. Basically, I would say, if you like the idea of hybrids, then druids, well, they are better equipped than they have been for quite some time indeed. Now, for the cons. Because there are cons. There is a deal breaker for me. I personally dislike how Eclipse feels. And this is purely because of how much time is spent kind of wasted going to where you want to be. Casting 3 of the sort of air quotes wrong spells every cycle to get into the eclipse that you want just doesn't really feel that good. It often kind of aligns poorly in combat. And having such limited control over eclipses, it is annoying when swapping between single target and AoE. Sometimes you really just want to hit Starfire on a group, because that's what you should do, but the game says it's time to press Wrath instead because you need to trigger that particular eclipse. Now that, and then the choice to tie Heart of the Wild to your chosen affinity in the talent tree, that bit might actually frustrate more often than not. So overall, I'm left not really feeling good about the idea of maybe playing a balanced druid for the whole expansion. Keeping their possibilities and broad combat utility in mind, I would be fine to play one, yes, but that's only really if I could confirm ahead of time that I could lessen those eclipse issues. Feeling like I'm supposed to open on a single target mob with 3 slowed starfires, that feels genuinely awful. But that said, if Legion legendaries are anything to go by, then balance could end up being super enjoyable with this expansion. But at any rate, playing Druid does offer 3 other roles. It is pretty good if you want to dip your toes in and out of all of them, just that right now, the Eclipse system is a little bit tricky. Next up, we've got the Hunter. It's never really been a bad pick, I think it's just not really been that exciting as of late. Getting Hunter's Mark baseline is then a bit awkward because you kind of have to apply it for the sake of the damage, but also it's on the GCD, so that's just a thing you've got to do, and it doesn't really feel good to use because, well, it's just not that interactive, so a little bit strange, just a maintenance thing. But that said, the return of Trank Shot, Scare Beast, and Eyes of the Beast, well, the latter one more just being themed than anything, that will at least feel good when, say, the Trank Shot and Scare Beast are useful. And with that said, let's get into the specs. Beast Mastery is largely the same as BFA, but with a few positive talent changes. Overall, it does feel pretty good to play. Stacking Frenzy with Barbed Shot and resetting Kill Command with Cobra Shot doesn't sound like a lot, but it's a satisfying core loop in practice. Having complete freedom to move around the place while doing that is a great experience because it's just really powerful, and the revamped talent Scent of Blood, well, that grants Barbed Shot charges when using Bestial Wrath, and that eases up on one of the most frustrating parts, relying on Barbed Shot to reset, which is pretty good. Then Beast Cleave's new target cap, well, that will make the spec feel a bit less insane in AoE, but I think Beast Mastery overall retains almost all of its strengths and of course retains its lack of weaknesses, plus a few good talent changes. They basically are strong in every situation. Their damage is smooth and reliable thanks to a low Bestial Wrath cooldown, they've got strong AoE and single target, and they don't even need to worry about movement. Honestly, to me, they're kind of the closest the game has to a ranged Demon Hunter in terms of just being a spec that is super good and doesn't really have a downside to really contend with. They don't have huge sustain or anything, I guess, but I mean, they're hunters, they've got their traps, and they've got aspect of the turtle to get them by. Now that said, it's not all perfect, so yeah, the AoE rotation, it does a lot of damage, but it's also not particularly exciting, I would say, and the pet revive timer going to 6 seconds, that's really going to hurt in, say, PvP or clutch situations. Also, I mean, yeah, their core can get pretty stale, right, if you've been playing it for a while, and if you're looking for Shadowlands to bring a lot more, then, well, that's not really happening, and their talent tree doesn't offer a whole lot else to help. Hitting the same few buttons, no matter what the situation is, and just watching your pet do all the work, to some players that will not feel engaging in the long term. So, overall, I would say Beast Mastery feels great in general because basically, it breaks the rules of the game. You've got freedom of movement and consistently high damage. That is something that many other classes can only dream of, and it's a great pick for anyone who wants to deal ranged damage with few restrictions. Okay, it's time for Marksmanship, and past the class-wide stuff, Marksmanship's other big change is the reworked volley talent. It's now a targeted ground ability just like it used to be that sets up multiple trick shots for some actually really solid and pretty fun to do AoE. Marksmanship really does feel good when you're picking off individual targets or getting those trick shots off, and being planted for a strong aim shot is nice. Ricocheting those trick shots feels great, especially with volley, and overall it's I'd say rotation that you could see as being simple but fairly elegant in how it works. Aim shot and then, arcane or multi-shot use focus, followed by your rapid fire and your steady shot to restore that focus. The spec has got, some variety with aim shots, hard cast versus everything else being on the move, and the solid pace increase during true shot does feel like a pretty great moment. It's less mobile than Beast Mastery, for example, but outside of the aim shots, you can still get a bit of work done on the move. Plus, of course, it's a hunter, so it's got its hunter advantages like the traps and the turtle. But that said, there are some cons, I would say. Lone Wolf's existence will still frustrate pet lovers. The experience of calling in a pet for a reason, but knowing that then your damage is worse as a result, that just won't feel good to many players. There's also something about the flow of play, and this is very subjective to me, that doesn't really feel that great. I mean, I did say it's a simple and decently elegant rotation in its, I think, fundamental design, but there is something about that flow that doesn't really mesh with me, something about the cast time of those steady shots that I just feel like, things are maybe a second and a half off and it could fit together a bit more tightly. But of course, that is very, very subjective for me, and I mean, it is something though I do find off-putting as compared to other classes. I preferred this spec in the Legion expansion to it in BFA, and Shadowlands essentially does nothing to change that for me, though I will admit that the new volley talent is pretty sweet.
So to conclude here, I've just got to say, play BM. Okay, that's kind of a joke, but there's a little bit of truth in that joke, where Marksmanship's strengths sometimes do make it more interesting, but it's got enough weaknesses and frustrations to kind of make up for that. And, like with most specs, this isn't a bad choice. It's just somewhat overshadowed by Beast Mastery, a spec that can do everything on the move with a whole boatload of utility, and really not much in the way of a downside. As to how that could be fixed, well, maybe Blizzard just needs to put a little bit more love into the Marksmanship Hunter in some way or form. I know there are many hunters from expansions before Legion, like myself, who, just have some abilities that we liked from the past that aren't really that much of a thing, or just aren't as cool as they were. So I think that's definitely somewhere to do a bit more iteration. Alright, next for the brutally underwhelming Shadow Priest. This one is pretty rough. It's not seen any substantial change, really, except for Shadow or Death going baseline. Instead of being an execute, it's now just an insanity generator that does damage to the priest if the target doesn't die, so that's fair enough. Then its old talent spot is now just a talent that improves Shadow or Death to give the priest a small flood of insanity if the target goes down within 6 seconds. Now, that's an upgrade for sure and stuff you can do, but it's a tiny band-aid on an otherwise very weak spec. The only other real change here is Void Bolt being castable during Mind Flay, like, Fire Blast or and Fireball for mages. And that does sound like an upgrade, right? And it is when you're standing still on target. However, Void Bolt used to be the only free GCD to actually move in, and then this change actually now kind of acts as a slight punishment for doing so. So it's really funny. It's a quality of life upgrade that's actually a slight player experience downgrade, which, that might be a first. A little bit funny. Now, Shadow Priest, it's about multi-dotting and casting Mind Blast to get into Void form, and then trying to squeeze every stack out of Void form by wasting no Mind Blast or Void Bolt cooldown. And to be clear, the issue isn't really with this concept right now. On a target dummy, lining things up without waste is fun, and the speed increases, with the Void form duration, and that feels pretty good. Just that, you're dealing with low ratings at the start of an expansion as you would expect. But I would say in reality, this spec just feels far too weak most of the time. Void form is balanced on a knife's edge, so anything that disrupts your cast kind of just, it ruins your day, and there's not really anything to mitigate that. And as always with this, it's a design that I think is great on paper, but struggles in reality. And that means that right now, it's hard to recommend in any content, right? It just, the damage struggles, it falls over pretty easily, right? In terms of, its rotation being interrupted. It's not particularly great in AoE or say Mythic Plus because of its ramp up time. It just struggles in real world scenarios. Now, I guess the unique strength that it does have as a DPS is Mass Dispel, so there's that. But for major weaknesses, that ramp up time, the lack of mobility, some mandatory feeling talents. In terms of raw power, it's not that much weaker than some other classes, yes, but it just feels way less satisfying to play right now. So hopefully the alpha sees more changes down the line because they are very sorely needed. Next up, the Mage. As always, I think this one is a pretty solid pick for a ranged DPS. With these pure DPS specs, you get 3 chances, right, for your spec being some combination of really fun and really strong. So it's a solid safety pick if you don't fancy playing any other roles in your character. Mages themselves don't have any major weaknesses as it stands, although Shimmer is going from 1 charge, to 1 charge, down from 2, so that absolutely is going to sting in the mobility department. But that said, you are getting Alter Time back, and you've got a lot of other existing tools as well, which should make you feel quite versatile. Hey, having so much control over your health and your location, especially with Alter Time, that is extremely powerful in the right hands. So, with that said, what about the specs? Arcane is as odd as usual. Its only notable change is that Touch of the Magi, the talent, that is now baseline as an active ability. Now, the talent that is replacing it, Enlightened, that rewards skillful mana management like the Azurite trait version did, so that's pretty cool. Oh, and they've also got mana gems back. Overall, I'd say that Arcane is a really cool concept, and it does remain much the same here. Played well, it can be very strong and very fun on single target. Arcane Blast and Missiles, they're really fun spells to use, and managing mana there is a unique and satisfying mechanic. Having a pool that you can burn or conserve to adjust your damage dealing sort of curve is pretty fantastic. It is, though, just a shame that it relies on arcane power dictating when to burn. Otherwise, I think it could really sort of fill the like unique advantage of deciding exactly when you want to go and do your big damage. So I guess there is that. Now, beyond that, Arcane's AoE is probably one of the weirdest parts of it. Arcane Explosion, right? That's a classic WoW ability. It really is. But their big AoE rotation is Arcane Explosion and Arcane Barrage. So yeah, they could probably do with some spicing up there. Beyond that, Arcane's AoE is probably one of the weirdest parts of it. I mean, Arcane Explosion, it's a classic WoW ability, but their big AoE rotation is, you know, Arcane Explosion, Arcane Barrage. So yeah, they could probably do with some spicing up there. Then the other major downside in Shadowlands, I'd say, is having too much setup. The addition of Mirror Image to their burst opener pushes it from too many GCDs to way too many GCDs, although that might be fixed over the alpha process. So overall here, I would say that Arcane is a niche but valid spec for mages. If you want to do single target damage and feel pretty rewarded for knowing your niche spec well, then yeah, Arcane's a good shout, in my opinion. Then next we've got Fire. It's another pretty well-rounded spec. The major issue is really coming back to it from patch 8.3 and losing the borrowed power that made the 8.3 version of it just so crazy. But if you are looking to pick up something fresh, then I guess that frustration won't really matter. Overall, I'd say it's simple but satisfying at its core. You spend Fire Blast to convert your Fireball crits into the instant Pyros. Then the Combustion Window, that is some of the most fun you can have as a caster. It's absolutely wild, throwing these huge instant spells one after another. Super satisfying. Generally, the regular movement offered by those instant pyros, as well as Fire Blast and Scorch in a pinch, that does actually make for movement really being a good bit less painful for them, right? They can actually do quite a bit there and reposition themselves, so that is quite nice. Sadly, though, the Shadowlands change to the Ignite dot is going to hurt a little bit. It now spreads on Fire Blast, and that does actually mean that you'll never really be spreading your biggest Ignite. This is where its AoE is a little bit awkward. It really just, you know, it is its single target with a few different talents, unless, say, Flame Strike was significantly buffed, which maybe would be a nice thing for Blizzard to do, so it would actually be used a bit more. Overall, though, I'd say that this all works with the fantasy of spreading the fire, but it is just a little bit bland. So a bit of spice there for the AoE really wouldn't hurt, but it is overall, I would say, still quite satisfying to use. Fire, I would say, will continue to be strong for basically all types of content, especially if the legendaries mimic Legion or 8.3's strengths. Overall, I'd say it's a pretty solid pickup, that's for sure. Time for Frost. I think it's a great option for a ranged DPS. Now, the big change with Shadowlands is that Flurry's debuff, Winter's Chill, has actually got two separate stacks now, instead of just being tied to the duration of its slow. And what that basically means, right, is that the guaranteed shatters that it provides are more consistent. Now, while I think, you know, using two Ice Lances in a row flows a bit worse than just one, I will say that with this, having 3 GCDs of movement after Brain Freeze procs, that actually does feel great. Now, like with the other specs, it offers plenty of movement, it has a strong toolkit for both single target and AoE. Now, on single target, the core of, you know, your Frostbolt, Ice Lance procs, the instant flurry procs to shatter, you know, it is a little bit on the simple side. It's quite RNG reliant, but if you then are adding in the Ebon Bolt and the Glacial Spike, I'll actually say that, yeah, it does make it feel pretty fun. Then in AoE, Frozen Orb and Blizzard feel like a nice duo, and the talented additions are really fun when you can use Frost Nova or, you know, Freeze to shatter them. The ability to, you know, meaningfully alter your build via talents is actually particularly well handled for the Frost spec, I would say, either to increase that complexity with new buttons or to make that simple core of the spec be a bit stronger. It's not all rosy though, being real. Relying on RNG procs, that can feel a little bit frustrating when a Glacial Spike comes up with no Brain Freeze and, you know, having so many cool abilities that are locked behind talents. You could see that as great customization, but you could also see that as a little bit of a negative. So overall then, when we think about how these mages tend to interact with borrowed power, especially with the legendaries of Legion, and they do seem to want to repeat those again in this expansion, I'd say that Frost will probably benefit quite well from all of that. And overall, I'd say that Frost is a range spec that I would highly recommend, really no matter the content. Sure, it doesn't have the highest skill cap ever, but it's pretty fun, and it actually just meshes with the core of playing WoW pretty darn well. So many people will see that and they'll pretty much think, well, couldn't ask for more. This is a spec for me. and I'd say that's a pretty reasonable choice. Next up, it's time for the shamans. So I'd say they had the bad end of the stick throughout BFA, but their luck seems to have somewhat changed in Shadowlands thanks to the revamps, which at the very least do show us that Blizzard, well, they have noticed that shamans have been in a bit of a sticky spot and that they do want to help them out. So as a class, they've got access to 3 viable roles, and their utility across the board feels very good, especially in Shadowlands when you've got more things just across all 3 specs. That stuff's really sweet. Really, their nature as a hybrid, it's not quite as realized as a druid's is, but they still do serve, like more purposes in group combat than many others. So yeah, your healing stream totems and all that existing, it's pretty cool, like across the board. Anyway, enough of that. Let's move on to the ranged DPS spec, Elemental. Alright, so Elemental saw some substantial changes, losing Maelstrom as a resource and then regaining Fulmination as a stacking buff, kinda like Warlords of Draenor. And basically, yeah, they're back to juggling cooldowns. Now this solved some of the problems faced in BFA, and I'd say it now does feel like a pretty old school spec as a result. The core of the spec is supposed to be, right, Lava Burst and Flame Shock, with then the lightning spells and Fulmination kind of acting as a layer beneath that. And in practice, this is, I'd say, mostly fun, but can feel a little bit awkward. I guess you end up in this situation where there is quite a few things to mentally balance as you're playing this one, especially in AoE. I mean, juggling flame shocks, lava surges, building instant earthquakes, and spending fulmination, it is actually quite a lot to do. Now, being able to dial complexity up or down with talents here is quite nice, as it is with the Frost Mage. And I guess thinking of talents, that brings us to the standout talent in our testing, which is Echoing Shock. Now, it echoes the next damage or healing ability that you cast, but that includes any effects that come with those, and that means it works with Elemental Blast, it works with the Stormkeepered Lightning Bolts, and that just allows for some really fun use cases. I think it's a really cool combination. Then having access to Spirit Walker's Grace to cast on the move, that is going to feel excellent on top of the instant casts that you can already avail of. That said, there are some negatives though, right? The feeling of ramping up to the instant earthquake is frustratingly long sometimes, and it can feel like there's just a bit too much going on to the point where it's hard to make good use of everything that you could have or could do. I think that'll be a pro for some people, a con for some other people. Like when your goal is maybe to get an earthquake, having to spend a fulmination and lava surges, then that can kind of feel like a nuisance, even though those are things that do normally feel good. Then the AoE strength that's apparent from Stormkeeper, Chain Lightning, and Earthquake kind of loses its magic when, it's a bit frustrating because of just how much is going on there. So there's that. I think the other angle of that, though, is that it certainly always feels like there's a lot to do. There's a lot in your kit. Generally, therefore, I would say that I quite like the Elemental Shaman as it is. I think if I was to put it in a few words, I would say it's messy, but in a fun way. And I think that this will very much be to some people's tastes and absolutely not to the tastes of some others. And that brings us on to our final ranged class, the Warlock. Another staple of ranged DPS over the years, the more tanky mage with a bit of a different feel going on. And that continues, right? It kind of feels how Warlocks have tended to feel for quite some time indeed. Now, in terms of changes, yes, having Demonic Circle added to their baseline, that's a great help for their usual lack of mobility. The return of curses is, I would say mostly good for the fantasy, although the potential of just becoming a curse bot is a little bit looming there. Then summoning your demon, right? That's moving to a 6-second cast, and that's just not going to feel great, especially if they continue to be pretty easy to kill. And certainly if you're an avid PvPer or you love, soloing super hard fights, then do keep that change in mind. Warlocks, though, are, as always, extremely useful in groups. Between the health cookies, their summon, gateway, they're always a solid class if you want to be picked for a raid. Now that said, lacking instant CC and a baseline interrupt definitely does, it hurts them in 5-man content, especially the Mythic Plus, and that's even more the case for Demonology. Now there is one more bonus actually, and as with the Mage, you do have 3 chances of having a fun and strong spec because you've got 3 DPS specs as this expansion, goes on. A heavy nerf or maybe a meta playstyle that you don't like, that's maybe less of an issue than if you were a hunter or, say, a shadow priest, right? Now that said, it is also possible that Blizzard will just nerf 2 of your specs into oblivion or have one of them be so OP that you feel like to play it. But, of course, yes, you do just get a little bit more in the way of options. Anyway, with that said, let's get into the specs. Affliction is one of the few specs that actually has an important baseline change. So, Unstable Affliction no longer costs soul shards, it actually lasts longer now, but it does have a limit of only like one debuff, right? And that just means that it goes on your priority target only. Then their new ability is Malefic Rapture, and that is actually their new soul shard spender. It deals damage to each dotted target for, each dot that is active. And I'd say that this does feel better overall. Malefic Rapture is super satisfying to use, although it does leave Affliction a little bit more boring on the single target side. But that said, the players who are going out of their way to have a multi-dotting class, I don't think they'll mind that too much. Now, once there are, a few mobs to then juggle those dots around, this spec does become pretty involved and pretty satisfying. The return of Sow the Seeds to its 2 extra seeds from Legion could also make Affliction extremely strong in mass AoE situations. That might be required less than before thanks to so many target caps, but it does give them a unique strength. They also, they should be pretty good in most situations, given their ability to move while they're dotting up targets and things like that. Now that said, for some players, the setup time of multi-dotting might feel like an issue compared to classes that can just hit and go, and that could be a problem in, the gotta go fast mentality of Mythic Plus content. So really here at the point stands, this is a spec that could very well be seen as maybe a meh for your PvP and your Mythic Plus, so it's probably worth another Warlock spec if that's the content you want to really focus on. But, broadly speaking, I think this is a spec that is achieving what it wants to do as the definitive multi-dotter in World of Warcraft. And then next, Demonology, which, if you just heard the last segment, if you're going for Mythic Plus, you still ain't going for Demonology, because sadly you did not see any meaningful changes, so it's in this situation, right, where the fantasy is really strong, but it's definitely not an exciting spec, at least in terms of changes. Now, I'd say that it's satisfying getting a veritable army on the go, and managing your soul shards with your demon bolt stacks. That does make for some simple but fun gameplay, but sadly, that's where the positives kind of end for me. There are all the usual downsides of relying on pets for damage, and there's a decent amount of ramp up that comes with this spec's core, right? Needing to wait on the first or second wave of demons to die for your instant death, or demon bolts even, that means that there's this annoying acceleration. Now, it's really cool when it gets going, but if you just want to go and start throwing out the deeps, that's going to slow you down. Now, the rarity of the instant casts also does mean that, well, yeah, they do feel like, a turret spec, right? They're just kind of planted there hurling things at the enemy. But the thing is, they've got no real way to combat their turrety nature, but they also don't really get that much reward for being a turret spec. Now, it also then doesn't change very much from single target to AoE, which could limit its ability to do damage in one of those scenarios. Mostly, I'd imagine Blizzard, sort of for fear of either AoE or single target getting out of hand in terms of balance. Then they also have a problem where they're stuck to one pet, the Felguard. Now, having a preferred pet, that's not new to Warlocks, but the problem is that World of Warcraft nowadays, it emphasizes interrupts more than ever. It's a really important mechanic. But the thing is that, not having the option to use a Fel Hunter makes this feel really bad in basically all content, especially when the Felguard's stun won't work or, is best used elsewhere. So all in all, it's cool. I think it's quite fun, but I would actually avoid playing it in most, realistic World of Warcraft situations. Warlock is a reliable class, but I don't have high hopes for Demonology across the breadth of content within the game. Look, if you really like the fantasy of summoning demons and you can get stuff done in this, then I would not worry about its damage output or its viability in most cases. Play what you want, but do just beware of the inherent weaknesses. Destruction has also received, no real changes. At its core, it's still about getting your fast Chaos Bolts by, doing confrigating for your backdraft stacks, getting those steady shards, coming in with your Incinerates and your Immolates, and being able to duplicate your single target spells to a second target with Havoc, that feels so good when it's used correctly. Destruction, it is an adequate description of playing this spec, at least as far as the gameplay is concerned. It's pretty fun. Now, there are issues, right? They're over-reliant on the, basically on the damage that comes from their Infernal window, right? That's a 3-minute cooldown, and it does feel like a really good cooldown to use, but the problem then is their damage outside of that doesn't really feel that great, so you're kind of limited by that cooldown window. Then also, Destro is a fun spec to play in my opinion, but it is, a little bit more turret-like than most specs, and it is really lacking in AoE, and those are just fundamental things of playing it. Certainly, I think a lot of players from the MoP era would like Killjaden's Cunning back. Rain of Fire, that is their only source of AoE without any, without the additional talent ones, and it feels both weak and too expensive. Having, strong 1 or 2 target damage, I mean, yeah, I get how that does make having weaker AoE, like mass AoE, an acceptable thing on paper, but the truth is that it also is just a bit boring in AoE. The AoE improving talents themselves, they occupy one row, so you can't even opt for like AoE, the expansive single target, or really do much there. It's just a pick one situation, and for the most part, people have just picked Cataclysm. So yeah, a little bit weak there. Generally, though, I would say the Destro is reliably strong in most situations. It probably will remain, I'd say, maybe being the go-to spec for the Warlocks, at least in a lot of scenarios. I think both it and Affliction should be in a pretty solid state. So, yeah, I mean, I wouldn't be overly worried about its performance or anything like that. Basically, it just does have these decently long-standing problems that the Warlock community have not been particularly happy about for quite some time, and, well, most of those are going to continue to be problems because they're not really being changed. Then, before we conclude, there is just some special mentions I'd like to make. So, the Druid is the class that is getting the most public communications on the forums right now. That's really because, Eclipse, that's been a contentious change, and it's just got this possibility to go very wrong or very right. So, look, I would expect a lot more tweaking with that. And then, while there is nothing concrete, Shadow Priests are probably the topic of the most discussion. They're in a really bad spot right now, and they could see substantial changes down the line. As Morgan Day said on Preach's stream, the Blizzard team is talking about it. So while nothing is guaranteed, I would say at this stage, not all hope is lost. Then also, a special mention here is the Elemental Shaman. Those changes have been received mostly well, and I think the talent tree offers great customization. It is far from perfect right now, but I'd say this, for me, it's got the potential to be a sleeper hit. I mean, my solid bet, right, if I was choosing personally, my solid bet is BM Hunter or Mage. And I'd say that right now the Ali Sham, it's far from perfect, but it's one that I've got my eye on. I mean, hell, especially with that really cool mauve mail armor, I think that'll all be quite fun. Anyway, no, it's, yeah, a lot of potential there, basically, but I think they just need to do a fair amount of tweaking. So I guess that's our footnotes. And that just means, to conclude, I'm going to say this. It is obviously, very obviously, too early to tell what 9.0's launch will look like. The point of this video is to give you a sort of high-level overview, who is winning so far, who's losing so far, what's seen a lot of attention from Blizz, what has not seen attention from Blizz. Most classes, though, I'll say this, my read right now, is most classes are going to be relying on borrowed power to be super interesting to play, but honestly, there aren't too many bad choices here. I mean, the only two ones that I'd really argue against would be maybe the Priest and the Druid, if you wanted to be a ranged DPS, purely because in both of those are specs that kind of do have issues right now, and if those aren't fixed, that's the only ranged DPS spec of that class. At least while, say, the Warlocks do have their ups and their downs, there is 3 to pick from, so, there's a decent chance one of them will be in a decent position. Then Shadow Priest, right, just thinking about those, Shadow Priest may just not see the love that it needs, and then if balance does not have Eclipse made less frustrating, I will certainly say I would avoid it. That said, the Warlocks, I think between Affliction and Destruction, they do have really solid options. Then, of course, the Mages and the Hunters, they've, I'd say, got pretty great options. More so, I mean, for me, more so the Frost Mage, the Fire Mage, the BM Hunter. I think there's a great safety net with those ones. I think they're just super reliable in the work that they're able to put out, and they're also quite fun. So that could be a thing. Of course, unless a nerf bat or something like that hits them. And I know that this really sounds like a middle-of-the-road answer in terms of those 3 being my recommendation here, but honestly, I would be particularly happy to play any of them. I mean, personally, I'm a particular fan of Affliction, BM, and Frost. Fire's also up there for me, but the thing is, it's, those are pretty solid right now, and it's very hard to see them not getting a good bit better once they've got their legendaries and their soulbinds, especially if the Legion expansion is anything to go by. Of course, though, before any of us can pull the trigger, we do just need to wait and see what classes will get the most fun borrowed power. Will there be cool legendary effects? That is the question. Now that said, range DPS, to sort of tie this up, range DPS certainly do have compelling options. I will say, though, they are just not really ones that are groundbreaking if you've been used to BFA. That said, the one thing that could make this a bit more groundbreaking is when our Covenant abilities are solidified, and if those are actually good, right? They do have the struggle of being on a class basis, not a spec basis, but if those are good, and then if we get strong spec-based legendaries like we did in Legion, that could be a real game changer. But of course, today's video was really communicating to you the baseline health of these specs.
And there you have it. That is our run through of the classes. And you know what's funny, right? Like throughout this video, I was consistently, every time I brought up legendaries and borrowed power and things, I kind of just thought like, oh, you're being so repetitive. You're just saying that again. But nah, you kind of would need to for doing a video like this. I mean, if you think about, I don't know, a fire mage in Legion, imagine a fire mage in Legion with only its artifact and no legendaries. Totally different ballgame. There are so many specs for whom these legendaries are going to be, I mean, pretty darn massive. I guess my hope really is that that they are spec-specific legendaries. I've got to imagine they are spec-specific legendaries and not class-wide ones. That would be a little bit silly. But yeah, that's basically what's up right now. There's a lot of good stuff, a lot of good stuff, some not so good stuff, and a lot of mixed stuff, a lot of things up in the air. Because of that, I'd really love to know, like after this video and after watching the 11 or 12 deep dives that we've done into all the other ranged classes or specs in our previous videos, I'd love to know, like, what do you think? What are you the most excited for? So, I mean, yeah, let me know what you think about that and this video. Thank you very much for watching. And with that, I will see you next time.